Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. The Bulgarians and Romanians are here, pooping on doorsteps across the UK, according to British tabloids. The same tabloids, of course, fail to mention that J.P. Morgan banksters have been defecating on our financial system for years and then collecting big bonuses from shaking down and scalping the population. Do the tabloids report this? No. Maybe it's because Jamie Dimon dances and hangs with hipsters with no faces, or that Jamie Dimon dances and tickles young women in oh so many places. No, it must be that Jamie Dimon dances and never ever fails to draw 4 aces. Yes, the dancing shakedown man always wins. Stacy.
Max. Well, yes, the Romanians and Bulgarians are here, and it was all the headline news across the UK, of course, leading up to January 1st. British bankers are worse than Roma beggars, says Damian Draghici, advisor to Romanian Prime Minister. So he is the minister in Romania for the Roma. And he says that the bankers are worse than any of the Roma beggars. And he says, quote, "The Roma begging in the streets are obvious because we see them. They ask for £1 or €1 and they bother us. Yet some of the people in the banks are stealing billions of euros, but nobody sees them because they are on the 60th floor."
That's very true. Very true. The people who come in, or people who are here, or just basically begging on the streets, it's something that is repeated in the boardrooms in the banks across the nation when they go begging to the central bank for free money, free change, to bail them out of their losing positions, to bail out their zombie banks. They're constantly begging the central bank, who for some reason always acquiesces and gives them money, I guess because they always threaten to crash the system unless the central bank gives them a few extra bob to cover a bad position.
Well, in fact, J.P. Morgan itself mentions this in a latest chart. J.P. Morgan presents, quote, "the era of central bank-driven equity rallies." And if you look at this chart, they themselves, J.P. Morgan points out Operation Twist, then Draghi's speech, then Abenomics, and every single time they say, woohoo, it drives the stock market higher. And who are they doing it for but for the likes of J.P. Morgan?
Well, this brings up a point that we've mentioned before, is that in these economies driven by central banks, they don't need workers. They don't need taxes from the workers to fund the government or to fund the zombie banks. So workers are treated poorly. They are essentially cast aside. People have the feeling as though they're being abandoned, because they are being abandoned, because these bankers don't need them. They don't need their taxes. They don't need their wages. They just go to the central banks to print money for free.
So all the policy is set around the beggars. Beggars are king in the American economy and the British economy.
That's absolutely correct. It is run by a beggar class. And of course, you know, going back 100 years ago, this would be called beggar thy neighbor, and they would use this on a global basis in terms of trying to debase each other's currencies to get a foothold up on global trade. But now they don't even bother trying to pretend as though they're involved in any underlying economic activity that portends to have something to do with supply and demand. They simply beg for begging's sake. They're just begging for begging's sake.
Well, so January 1st, all the Romanians and Bulgarians were expected to arrive, you know, millions of them, according to the likes of the Daily Mail. Well, so all these journalists and politicians were actually waiting at the airports for these people to arrive to see what they had to say. "I don't come to rob your country." First Romanians to arrive in Britain following changes to EU migrant rules insist they are looking for work after being greeted at the airport by Labour MP Keith Vaz. So they say they're here not to rob people and steal, where bankers show up and that they promise this is how David Cameron entices them in. "We have the loosest regulation in the world. You could rehypothecate infinitely here. Come on down."
Well, remember, during the height of the Greek crisis, I suggested on this show that if you see a guy in a 3-piece suit and briefcases arriving in Athens, these were beggars, and that they should be treated as beggars, and yet they were lauded as saviors. So any people that show up across this border, you know,
say, shoo, go away, beggar.
Or make them the president, or make them the prime minister, because that's who gets all the power now, are the ones who can beg the most.
So as I said, you know, the bankers are encouraged to come here to the UK, and they're not told to not beg. In fact, they're encouraged to beg and to plunder and to steal. And one of the shticks is always to throw a ring on the ground, and they convince the person, oh, look, I found this gold ring. If you give me 20 pounds for it, I'll let you keep it. And of course, the greedy person thinks it's worth like 150 or 300 pounds, and they think they're going to make money on it. Of course, it's a fake. Well, here's the equivalent of a banker gold scam. How to keep banks from rigging gold prices. Authorities around the world are gradually piecing together a shocking picture of how banks have manipulated benchmarks that influence the price of everything from mortgage loans to foreign currencies. So all the benchmarks are being rigged, essentially begging. They're front-running, they're taking from the population, they're begging, they're picking their pockets. They're picking the pockets of the population. And the Bloomberg then goes on to note all of the evidence about the gold price, the gold fix here in London, happens twice a day, that this is being manipulated. They say the price-setting mechanism known as the fixing provides an easy vehicle for manipulation. Twice every business day in London, representatives of 5 banks and some select clients participate in a phone call in which offers to buy and sell gold are put forward. These calls determine the morning and afternoon gold fixings, which serve as the benchmark for trillions of dollars in transactions around the world.
Yeah, and we know that the price is fixed. Every single index is rigged. We know this. I think finally gold is being discovered to be rigged. It was the last market to be talked about in terms of being rigged, because it's the one market that is the litmus test to decide whether or not the dollar-based markets are being rigged. So now we know that, yes, the gold market is also rigged.
Well, yeah, it's rigged by central banks on the one hand in order to make their fiat currencies look stronger. But this is a 20-year chart here from Bloomberg, and this goes back to 1993 through 2012. And you can see that the spot price of gold tends to drop sharply around the London evening fix, which is 10 a.m. New York time. A similar, if less pronounced, drop in price occurs around the London morning fixing. The same daily declines can be seen in silver prices from 1998 through 2012. So that's 20 years of data. Every single morning in London, at the morning fixing here, it drops a little bit. But at the evening fix, opening in New York, it drops precipitously. This is over 20 years at the same time. Now, Bloomberg says about that, for both commodities, there were on average no comparable price changes at any other time of the day. These patterns are consistent with manipulation in both markets. Now, of course, anybody could have front-run this because it was so consistent for the past 20 years that any normal person out there could be able to front-run this, knowing that they could buy right after that morning, basically in New York time, and sell before the following morning.
That's right. I mean, I saw a study that said if you were to buy gold in Asia and sell it in the New York opening, you would have annualized rates of like 40%.
Yeah.
But, made Warren Buffett look bad by comparison. Because it's so predictable and it's so ingrained in the psychology of everyone out there. They know that the gold price is fixed. But the point is that if you're going to be dissuaded from allowing Romanians or Bulgarians into your country because you fear that they're beggars, it's a duplicitous statement, isn't it? Because you've got beggars at HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, and RBS, and the Bank of England under Mark Carney, and George Osborne. These are the biggest beggars of all. They go with their begging bowl into the indexes every single day, and they beg for more money. And the thing is, do you want to feed? There's a big sign at the park: "Don't feed the ducks." Why? Because the duck crap is uncontrollable. They can't hire enough people to take care of the duck crap if you feed the ducks too much. Same thing with George Osborne. You're just feeding him the ability to manipulate these markets, and Osborne crap is littering the country, and they're showering the country in this kind of irresponsible fiscal policy, or fecal policy in his case. And the result is advancing poverty and the underwriting of a class of kleptocrats and beggars in this country that have total disregard for human life. They don't have any regard for human life. That's not the kind of people you want to feed.
Well, this gold rigging over 20 years is daily pickpocketing. You can't see it as anything other than that. So if you don't have a problem with bankers doing that, then shut up about the Roma doing it. Who cares? If that's our society, this is what we do for a living here. They're very British, in fact. If that's what we do every day in the London gold fixing, welcome. This is what we do here.
I'm sure that's what gave them the idea to come here, is that this is the Mecca for rigging markets and begging. So why not come here and do what you do best right here, except get paid a lot more for it?
Americans on wrong side of pay gap run out of means to cope. So since we went off the gold standard, as we've covered, real incomes have declined drastically for working class Americans, anybody who's not in the top 0.1%. And they've coped with the declining real incomes by the housewives beginning to work through the 70s and 80s and 90s. Now, well, that's at peak housewife working, peak women in the workforce. Then men were getting 2 or 3 jobs. That's also at the peak. They can't get any more jobs than that, and home equity extraction, but we can't do that anymore because of the tightness of credit available to Joe Bag of Donuts. So now the result has been a downsizing of expectations by almost 2 to 1, 64% to 33%. Americans say the U.S. no longer offers anyone an equal chance to get ahead, according to the latest Bloomberg national poll. And they look at this, and Bloomberg finds that a few of the reasons are the top two reasons are government and Fed policies. As Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan pointed out with that chart, the equities rally is where the top 5% really have their wealth concentrated. Now, government policy taxes that a lot less than they tax income from labor. And then the Fed is actually driving up the price, i.e. driving up the wealth of the top percentage.
Right, so they've squeezed people now to the point where they just can't squeeze anymore. Women enter the workforce, men have gotten multiple jobs, and they use the home equity line of credits to extract wealth from their houses. That's now finished. And then the stock market's trading in a bubble territory, so that's kind of run out of runway, so to speak. So what's next? What rabbit will be pulled out of the hat to try to keep this debt marathon going?
Well, begging. We're living in a beggar economy. They have to start begging. Forget all this stupid thing of working and contributing to the wealth creation. Start begging, taking, pickpocketing.
Fair enough. America, a nation of beggars. Well, I'm sure it had to come to this. Very well then, we must go. Thank you.
Keep begging.
All right, stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to James Turk. He's the author of a new book, The Money Bubble, What to Do Before It Pops. James, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
All right, let's talk about the money bubble. Talk a little bit about it. What is it about?
Yeah, in 2004, John Rubino and I wrote The Coming Collapse of the Dollar, and we had 2 basic themes in that book. One was that housing was in a bubble and it was going to collapse, and secondly, he wanted to buy gold because it was undervalued and going to go much higher. What happened in 2008 we thought was going to bring the ultimate collapse of the dollar, but it didn't. It's been postponed by this unprecedented amount of money printing by central banks around the world. So earlier this year, as gold started to slide, John and I started thinking, well, maybe we should write a follow-up, explain why gold is still good value, why it's going to go much higher, and the bigger issue, that what's created as a result of the 2008 collapse and government response to it, which is the money bubble. Fiat currency is going to be, that is the bubble, and that's what's going to pop.
We talk about the outcome that many expected after the 2008 crash. One was massive money printing, which we got. Inflation, which we didn't get in the way we thought we would get it. We got it in asset price inflation, and we got it in some price inflation, the CPI, et cetera, but not to the point where the mainstream media was reporting like they would back in the 1970s. Oh my God, there's an inflation ramping up. There's no wage inflation. Wages have been stagnant. So it seems to me, and we're finding out more about this, that the inflation, one of the key inflation metrics that we've seen that people haven't talked about, and I think it plays into this money bubble idea, is the inflation in in manipulation and fraud and index manipulation. So many of these indexes are being manipulated, we're finding out, whether it's energy index, LIBOR, Forex, the gold market. So the problems are there, but they're masked to some degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And this is one of the things we cover in the book, that a lot of false reporting that is being done by governments. You know, the Consumer Price Index doesn't really truly report anymore the cost of living. John Williams of shadowstats.com does an alternative inflation calculation using the same one the government did back in 1980 without all of the modifications that they've made in subsequent years to make inflation look less than it really is. And today inflation is running about 9%. But you know, you can see it in other ways, Max. And you know, inflation takes a while for it to build. And right now it's been building in terms of people who are rich. Look what's happening to collectibles. Look what's happening to real estate in places like here in London. These are just going through the roof. You know, smart people understand that holding dollars in a bank account doesn't make sense anymore. Holding euros in a bank account doesn't make sense anymore. You want to acquire tangible assets of all sorts because we're in a money bubble, and these fiat currencies are going to pop.
Right, so the money bubble, we see it already in terms of London real estate prices, the art market's trading extraordinarily high, collectibles, raised collectibles. We don't see it in gold, and it's turned out that gold, that manipulation in gold is such where the price is as a price signal, it would take something away from the masking of what's really going on, so it's very carefully managed by the central planners and the central bankers.
Exactly, but it can only go on to the extent that central banks are willing to empty their vaults completely. And when those vaults are completely emptied, then the price is going to go much higher.
Let's talk a little bit about that emptying of the vaults. In other words, from what I understand, the gold, the banks, the bullion banks who have a relationship with the central banks of the world, they are allowing folks to sell futures contracts essentially naked. And then they make good on those contracts at some point by taking money out of the vaults of the central banks. And this gold is going east. It's going to China. It's going to Bangkok. And so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the gold is flowing from west to east, and this has been a trend that's been underway for several years, but it's really accelerated over the past 12 months. And it's flowing from west to east because in the west we generally don't understand gold's utility, whereas in the east they understand gold's usefulness. The Chinese character for gold and money are in fact the same thing. So they intuitively understand gold's utility and its usefulness as money. And as long as wealth is being created in that part of the world, which it is, gold is going to flow from west to east. And unfortunately, it's a replay of what happened in the 1960s with the cartel called the London Gold Pool, tried to keep gold at $35 an ounce. Eventually, there was 10,000 tons of gold dishoarded from Fort Knox during the 1960s to try to maintain this price, but ultimately the market knew that gold was worth more than $35 an ounce. Today, the circumstances are slightly different because it's harder to actually see the gold coming out of central bank vaults because, again, the false reporting that we're seeing and the misleading accounting. But we can see it in terms of the flows. So, the gold is going out of the vaults, and eventually we're going to see a ratcheting up of the gold price, just like happened after the London Gold Pool collapsed in 1968.
I want to talk about Paul Krugman for a second, who's over there at the New York Times. And you can't have a big kind of state-sponsored manipulation without a propagandist. And Paul Krugman, who's their ostensibly economics writer, although he doesn't seem to know much about economics, has made a couple of remarkable statements recently. One is that the U.S. dollar is backed by guns. There's no intrinsic value. That we understand. But if you don't take it, we're going to shoot you. Essentially, that's the statement. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's not the way markets work. Markets work on voluntary cooperation between individuals. And it's markets that chose gold and silver as money in the first place. What governments have done is they've used guns to supplant the free flowing of gold and silver as currency and money throughout the world. But what they've created is this authoritarian environment in which governments and individuals, the power balance is no longer balanced the way it should be, which is why you see these various uprisings or disruptions in different parts of the world, most recently in Italy with the pitchfork movement that's going on down there. So we're heading off in the wrong direction.
Right, so authoritarianism is, in the U.S., you don't expect it. But clearly, if the New York Times is calling for authoritarianism and saying, take our money or we'll kill you, that's not a free market. That's not a condition of supply and demand. That's not what you'd expect to read in the pages of Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I mean, this is an empire that's collapsing, that's relying on manipulation of propaganda. Now, I want to touch on something we talked about in London a couple of years ago. I brought to your attention, and at that time you were very curious about it, but now it seems as though you've gone full-fledged, supporter. And this is very interesting because of the gold crowd seems split. Some are for it, some are not. Talk about it. Of course, I'm talking about Bitcoin. Paul Krugman recently came out and said Bitcoin is evil. So if he hates it, we know that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, and
Turk.
I saw the Financial Times said that Bitcoin's going to be under $50 sometime in the near future, which obviously is, in my view, is not going to happen. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was a little bit skeptical about Bitcoin in the beginning, but I'm actually a believer in it now, and I do own some Bitcoin. And the reason why I own it is I think it's a technological advancement, and it accomplishes what we tried to do to a certain extent with gold. The difference, of course, is that gold is something that governments want to control and regulate, whereas Bitcoin is beyond government regulation, and that's really one of its beauties. And I think that's one of the reasons why an authoritarian like Krugman, a lover of government, hates Bitcoin.
So the fact that you can't regulate it is one of its attributes.
Except it is regulated. It's not regulated by government. It's regulated by the market. It's regulated by everybody who studied it and analyzed it and sees that, yes, this thing has utility and it has usefulness. That's the best form of regulation. I mean, government regulation fails all of the time. Look at 2008. Every one of those institutions that failed was heavily regulated. What did it accomplish? That regulation didn't accomplish anything. But when you're regulated by the market and people can pick and choose what's good and what's not good, that's the best form of regulation. That's what Schumpeter called the creative destruction of capitalism. The best survive because they make a profit and they stay in business. They don't get government subsidies or government handouts to continue them operating.
Is it money? That's the question, because we know from Aristotle's definition, money has four basic attributes. It's portable, it's fungible, it's desirable, and there's an intrinsic value case for gold.
Yes.
That's the one area that people are tripped up on. Do you see an intrinsic value, or what is your intrinsic value for Bitcoin, if you can speak on that?
Well, I like to distinguish between money on the one hand and currency on the other. Money is this mental tool that we use for economic calculation, but we then use a form of currency that represents the actual money. Money is a tangible asset, though, in the sense that we humans advance because goods and services pay for goods and services. If, for example, you're a shopkeeper and I say, I'm going to pay for this loaf of bread next week, that transaction has not been completed. You've accepted credit. If I pay for that with fiat currency, you've accepted credit. You've got a risk, a payment risk, until you actually take that fiat currency or convert that promise into some good or service, because it's goods and services that enable us to raise our standards of living. It's not financial assets. It's not promises. They're forms of financial wealth as opposed to forms of tangible wealth. And it's ultimately tangible wealth which creates higher standards of living.
This is an excellent point. You're saying if you give me £1 for goods and service, that pound really has no value until I convert it back into a goods and service.
Exactly.
So people who say Bitcoin, well, it has no value because conversion, there's a risk of owning it or holding it. Well, paper money has a similar risk. It has no value until you put it into something.
Exactly right. But the thing is that Bitcoin has this value because of its utility as a form of currency. And that is the unique attribute that it brings to the table. And I think Bitcoin is going to have a profound influence on global economics, global trade, the global economy as we move forward from here. When I talk about Bitcoin, I should say that I mean cryptocurrencies. Because, if you remember, back in 1979, I bought my first spreadsheet. It was called VisiCalc. It was replaced by 123. It was replaced by Microsoft Excel. There may be other cryptocurrencies that come along the road at a future date that might be better than Bitcoin. But the concept of cryptocurrencies itself is really the technological innovation. And Bitcoin is the prominent one at the moment as being the first mover.
Can you say that the way that gold is a precious metal, that in case of Bitcoin, you could consider it a precious number? Because the mining that goes on, you're finding these numbers that are only possible through the array of hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of computers. They exist in cyberspace somewhere, but they have to be mined. They are precious numbers. So can you say that this represents precious numbers the way that gold is a precious metal?
Yes, I think that's a very good way of comparing the two. There is one slight difference. Bitcoin is tangible in the sense that there is a computer code and everything backing it, but it's not corporeal like gold. You can't put it in your hand. But you can actually take a Bitcoin and put it on a piece of paper and use that as a form of currency as well. You know,
It's
Bitcoin,
corporeal?
Yeah, it is corporeal. And yeah, in
so
that
that's
sense.
another argument flushed.
One thing to add is that, you know, we've been studying Bitcoin for the past year at Gold Money, and we've recently opened a small subsidiary in the UK called Netagio, Netagio. And what we're doing initially is offering storage for Bitcoin, but ultimately we're going to move further and further into the Bitcoin economy.
All right, well, that's all the time we have. James Turk, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, James Turk of Gold Money, but he's got this new book out, The Money Bubble. It's on Amazon as an ebook on a Kindle, and then it'll be corporeal, and you can hold it while you're mining for Bitcoin. Until next time, bye, y'all.